Well, hey everybody, welcome back. This is like episode 1, the real episode 1.
The Phantom Menace.
Yeah, of the podcast. We're actually starting with episode 4,
Yeah,
6, 9, 27.
Then we'll come back 20 years later. We'll jump back in and create some insert episodes that go in between.
They're not worth watching, I can tell you already. Whatever we do in 20 years, it's not worth doing.
But we're going to try our... Anyway, moving on.
We'll try our
Welcome
hardest.
back. Welcome back. We're glad to have you here. Whether you are from Family Church or Waterdown or a friend or family of the church family, and this is a way that you are seeking to grow in your faith, we're thrilled to have you here. Thrilled to have you here. Grant, do you want to explain what we're trying to do here?
Yeah,
in a nutshell. For
sure. So, working through the book of Nehemiah as local churches in the city of Hamilton and beyond in our areas that we believe God has planted us. And I think that's going to be a theme that we're going to pick up on all the way through this year, is really that understanding our location as more than just like, we liked that house and so we bought it.
Yeah.
Or we rented it, or, whatever. But
this is where I landed, and therefore...
Yeah. We really want to encourage all of us to think about how God has planted us in a particular place. And so, we've talked about the reality that, our congregations, our churches are part of the presbytery, like this grouping of churches in the city of Hamilton and beyond, but that we pull from all over the place. We've got some, families coming in from Burlington, and, you're in Stony Creek. And,
and our online community, we have families that are worshiping with us that may never set foot in the building. Right,
or even in the province.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so no matter where you are, we want to help you take practical next steps with your faith related to a lot of what we're working through as congregations. So right now, for our sermon series, we're working through the book of Nehemiah and talking about the theme of rebuilding. So rebuilding our lives, in this weirdly semi-post-COVID, as we're still wearing masks.
That's right.
Right. But like in this season, talking about rebuilding as individuals, rebuilding as families, rebuilding as churches, and really like rebuilding in our communities. And we want this podcast to help you take those next steps, think about the next steps. Yeah. And one of the ways that we're going to do is just by talking through some of the points that we've both hit on in the sermon.
Yep.
Asking questions of each other. And, that's really what, at the end of the day, we want to encourage you to do. And that is to ask questions, ask meaningful questions, ask the questions that you don't think are acceptable to ask the questions that, what are the things that you're wrestling with in your faith, in your spirituality, in your understanding of who you are and who God is, and in relationship to this community. Yeah. So we're hoping that the book of Nehemiah, this series, is going to be a jumping off block for that. Yeah. But, it may not be limited to a discussion of Nehemiah. So that's it. Like, practical, meaningful next steps. We want to hear your questions, all of those things. Yeah. And this is really just a chance to dive a little deeper in that direction. So if you missed the sermon, we both, Alex and I both preached on Nehemiah 1 and 2 to kick off the series. And it's always a challenge to do that in a short, concise way. I think my sermon was like 30 minutes. It was like 29 minutes and 59 seconds. But if you haven't watched it, those are both available on our YouTube pages. Yep. So Knox Church Waterdown and Family Church of Heritage Green. Yep. You can go back and find those. Yeah. Listen to this and then go back and listen to those sermons.
Yeah, it's all there. And so you have 2 to choose from, which is great. You'll probably notice some similarities in terms of the structure and points made, and that's intentional. We are connecting about that because we want, again, we're experimenting with what this looks like for 2 churches to be cooperating a bit more intentionally, and 2 pastors cooperating a bit more intentionally. And so, there's a lot of scripture that's very contextual, and that is our goal, to make it contextual. And there's a lot of stuff that's universal, and so it's our hope that we can find a good balance between the stuff that's universal between our 2 contexts, recognizing that they're pretty different, in some ways, and in other ways very similar. And so, it's going to be great.
Yeah.
Cool.
So Nehemiah is this brilliant book. I think we were at a conference somewhere
Yes.
where one of the speakers was like, nobody ever preaches on Ezra or Nehemiah. And so we're like, tell you what, let's preach on Nehemiah.
Well, I think actually maybe an hour later at that very conference, I was presenting and referenced Nehemiah. So I kind of felt, I hope that didn't come across as a shot across the bow, but it's...
I promise it was written before.
It was. It's in my
right?
notes. This is, look at the previous saved versions, but
Yeah.
it's a fantastic book about rebuilding.
Yeah.
Like it really is.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that it's a first person account makes it even that much cooler.
Yeah.
That it's like, yeah.
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 It's a memoir. It's so we're both just before we jumped on to recording, we're talking about how like we're both just starting into
Yes.
the book Will, which
Yep.
is like the semi-autobiography of Will Smith, and
Yep.
that made it into my sermon, which
Nice. There you go. Yeah.
but take us, Alex, take us through just kind of the historical, locate Nehemiah for us within the greater context of the biblical narrative,
Yeah.
and what God is doing in the world.
Well, as we know, I mean, it's sort of the tail end of the Old Testament. It's in sort of that last chunk. It's 600 years before Jesus was born, and it's at a really pivotal moment in Israel's history. And so the Old Testament is the formation of God's people, God revealing Himself to His people, and trying to establish them. And I say the word trying, not that God is unsuccessful, but the goal of the Old Testament is to establish this people who will be this holy priesthood, this example to the nations, who will stand out as so very different in their time. And I mean, what's awesome too is that it continues to stand as very different in our time.
Yeah.
But Israel, stumbles and trips and falls and sometimes leaps backwards, leaps off cliffs in their defiance or just missteps, right? And this is when Nehemiah arrives, right at a very pivotal time of misstep, when Israel has split into two nations. So in and of itself, that's an example of the brokenness, not one nation anymore.
Yep.
And those nations are fighting amongst themselves and fighting with their neighbors. Judah, the nation to the south, has been conquered by Babylon several times, and God's people have been largely carried away into exile. And that brings about it. I think, a key verse for us at Family Church was this verse from Jeremiah about in that time of exile, as you're heading off, it's almost, God waving and saying, well, and don't forget, be a blessing to the country where you're going, and work and pray for the welfare of those people. And I can just imagine for Israel, this mindset of, sorry, what? Why are we working and praying for the welfare of the country that just crushed us? And But this is the context in which they lived, and that's the context in which Nehemiah lived, where he was called to honor God in a foreign land, in a foreign place, and maybe there's a bit of that's relatable. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't like to draw necessarily immediate 1-to-1, 100%.
Totally.
We live in Canada. It's completely free to be Christian and gather and worship, and we're working through a difficult political season right now for sure, social season.
Yep.
However, nobody's knocking down the doors because we're recording this podcast with Bibles open in front of us. But I think that a lot of what we are feeling right now as a people is that sort of collective, not really sure where we are, where we stand.
Well said.
Certainly, as the church, there's this sense in which, we don't exist in a Christian culture anymore.
No,
we
very
exist
post-Christian.
Post-Christian, so to assume that our society is going to have Christian values, or even is going to respect Christian values, just is not the right place to start anymore.
Yeah.
So maybe as a starting point, certainly to that wave that you do, right? When God says, hey, you're being taken off into exile, it's for some very political reasons. It's for some very spiritual reasons.
Right. Yep.
Jeremiah, and we were talking about this, actually names the defiance or the rejection that Israel has for God by saying that they've rejected the Lord,
Yep.
and they've dug their own cisterns. Like they've looked for life
Yep.
in places other than their relationship with God. So that's kind of like all that's going on. But
Yeah.
God still says, "Hey, go and be a blessing. You're still my people. This
Yeah.
is a difficult situation." And we, I think as we turn our minds toward the world, something that we talk about is, as a starting place, I think just as you've described it, is helpful.
Yes.
Because here's a people going into a completely foreign land
Yeah.
with different political situation, different religious situation, different cultural context, cultural norms, like everything has changed.
Yeah.
And yet God is saying, go and be there
Yeah.
and bless those people.
Yeah.
Guess what? Like, it's going to be hard.
Yeah. Sure.
And I do think that nobody in Israel is going to Babylon
Excited.
or like expecting to find Jewish customs.
Sure.
Right? Like, it's like everybody knows it's
Yes.
going to be completely different.
Yeah.
And I think that's the right expectation that we should have
Right.
as Christians in the world.
Yep.
It's going to be different. Don't
Yeah.
don't judge people because they don't have Christian values. I mean,
No.
they're not Christian.
No, they're not. No.
So
Yeah.
why should they?
That's
why
right.
why should we expect them to have that? And so that's just a fun place to start conversation.
So good. Yeah. Yeah.
So difficult political, difficult historical, difficult religious situation. I love that,
Yeah.
10 years. It's not that much time. But one king's like, forget it, we don't want to pay taxes. And then they come in and
They
crush
get
them.
Thumped. Yeah.
And then they're like, okay, fine. And then 10 years later, they're like,
thing.
hey, I got a good idea. Let's not pay taxes again. And then they get wiped out. And man,
Yeah.
how much is that like our spiritual life
Ugh.
as followers of Jesus?
I could just imagine the times that God is shaking his head going, okay, go for it. Rock on. Rage on, guys. Yeah, nope, revolt. Yep, you got it. Yeah, okay. I'm still here. Okay. Yeah. No, it's big. And I love that, that reminder you gave of like this different culture that we live in. It's out of that Nehemiah still has this incredible, profound faith. Right? And so what a reminder to us that the culture, God is the one who feeds our faith. God is the one who grows us, the Spirit in us, Christ leading us, all of that stuff. The world around us doesn't need to shape us, clearly, because Nehemiah, this guy who's living each day on, really what people think of the king, right? Like whether or not he makes it to dinner or not is entirely about, what people think of the king, entirely out of his control, and yet still has this profound faith that rocks the world and flips a lot of things on its heads. And so what a great reminder that the culture around us may feel very oppressive at times, and it will not defeat us. It will not defeat you.
And not only that, but you might be called out of it or into it to do something very significant. So not
Sure.
only is it you're just going to scrape by, it's not going to defeat you. No, actually, it might be exactly the formation that you need for God to call you out and into something, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And so here's Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king, which, for sure is on the one hand, he might drink poison at any moment, right?
Yeah.
Like, literally is required to, if there's I'm not sure exactly how it would have worked every single day, but the dude's sipping on wine. Be like, okay,
That's
well,
right.
Nehemiah's not dead, so it's probably safe to give to the king.
Yep.
And yet it's also this position of access.
Yes.
Right. And influence.
Yep.
It's not like he, went back to the dungeons. It's not like he was in prison. It's not like he was, drug up and force fed this. It was a position of stature and influence and
trust. He's got to trust that Nehemiah isn't the one poisoning his cup himself. Guess who's the last guy to touch the cup before the king gets it?
Yeah.
Right? So there's there's good reason there for there to be a good relationship, and we see that here, right? Which is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, you were building on something there.
No. I think that it's helpful to think through where Nehemiah was, because it does point us in the direction of the importance of what he's called into.
Yes.
And so, like, one of the things we talked about how, and we're not working linearly through our messages, like,
Sure.
at this point.
Yeah.
but like, it was, so Nehemiah's position, his relationship to the king, all of it prepared him for what God was going to do,
Yeah.
and for this call into something significant for the people of Israel.
Yes.
Certainly for, like, the kingdom of Judah, for Jerusalem.
Yes. The
And
city itself.
And yet it still required him to, like, choose to leave all of it behind. And
Yes.
it's still, so, it was an uncomfortable move for Nehemiah, for sure.
Sure.
Like, nobody teaches the cupbearer how to build walls.
No, this is it. I touched on this at the end of my message on Sunday, that just like, this is not a lateral move of a guy being like, okay, I want you to go and be the cupbearer in Jerusalem now.
Yeah.
And you're going to share all the good things that you've learned in Babylon. It's like, no, I'm going to, that's great that you've knit things your whole life. Awesome. Well, now we're going to carve things out of marble. And those are very, very, very relatable skills. And no, not at all. I mean, that's even a little too close. It'd be like, for me, God calling me into mathematics or something that would just destroy my heart.
That'd be my
from the
nightmare.
outset. Yeah, absolutely. I continue to be in dread as my daughter, our eldest, is in grade 5. She's getting closer and closer to that point where I know I won't be able to help her. Like,
Yeah.
closer and closer, man. But like, even in that, it's that's just me and what I myself can conceive as what I can accomplish, and what I am useful for, and what I am, it's me looking at myself and going, oh, no, I'm the dad who's good for, I'll help her with the art stuff, and I'll help her with the, English things, and we'll always have fun, and she can always turn to me to be silly. Yeah, those are the things I see in myself, but the stuff that God sees in us, wow. Like you said, the courage that it takes Nehemiah, the faith that he has to step out of this comfortable place, this known place, into something that is just, it's all about, there's nothing easy about where he's going.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And he knows that from the outset, right? Like, it's not like he's going in with rose-colored glasses on saying, this is actually a good, this is going to be good. This is going to be good for me. I need to grow. I need to, and I think people are ready for this. This is really going to, no, this guy knows probably better than most the opposition that, and we're going to get into this in weeks to come, but like the opposition that he's going to get even from within.
Mm-hmm.
As a member of the King's Court, he would have been fully aware of all of that stuff. And he's still going, all right, Lord, let's,
I'm in.
let's do her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So Nehemiah goes, and I think, like, that's where we ended the messages for Sunday, right? That change and seasons of rebuilding require us at some point to just make this decision to go and to begin, to start. But Nehemiah actually does a little bit of, like, preparation before going. And, we talked about that. And I think that if in how we're going to move through the series is that there are seasons of rebuilding as individuals, as families, in relationship, and in community as churches, like at every level, we're entering into a season of rebuilding. What are some of the things that you have found in reading this? I mean, even in your own faith, that prepare you for seasons like that? Because Nehemiah doesn't just, like, he goes, but it's out of this wealth of relationship with God.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the key thing. And we both zeroed in on this on Sunday, that it's a real emotional response for him. And I think a lot of us know this, that we might respond in some ways to threats or fear or but what makes a real difference is when there is a heartfelt response at the center of it. And I think, and again, we both zeroed in on this on Sunday, but like how Nehemiah starts from this place of just being very real with himself and with God. And because, I mean, Scripture is filled with, and our lives are filled with, and maybe you are one. Maybe you serve with people that are, reluctant servants are a hard thing to see for a lot of reasons. It's hard to see in terms of, well, we don't need to go there, but Nehemiah is not that. Yeah. He's not reluctant. He might be worried. We don't get that impression shared with us, but I mean, he's human. I imagine it's not a hard thing to imagine. But maybe stressed. Maybe he's going, oh man, what did I bite off here? Right? Yeah. Like when he's halfway there and going, this is a long way from the palace. But it's a real emotional response for him. And I think that is such an important piece. And I know we chatted about this on Sunday, and this was part of my challenge for family church as we were coming out of this, was to ask yourself, where am I emotionally right now? Because as you said, coming out of this, it is very important. The time of putting on pretenses is going to be over pretty soon. Yeah. Where we're able to say, I'm doing okay. You're not doing okay. This hasn't been that bad. It has been bad. Well, I think some friendships will bounce back. They may not, because we've gone to a lot of different places over the last 2 years. And some of those are going to take a lot of work to get through. Yeah. And at the start of it, you need to be in that place of an accurate reflection of how you're feeling. Yeah. And what's in front of you. Because if you're missing that, my dad is a retired military guy, and frequently in life will say, time spent on reconnaissance is time seldom wasted. And like, I mean, it's true if you're preparing to attack somebody, but it's also true of a plan of attack in terms of our faith, that like, if you don't spend the time to do the reconnaissance work in your own life and find out what's really going on there, our starting point will always be skewed. And yeah,
I'm gonna forever picture your dad with like binoculars, like just like peering out his front window.
Field glasses. They're not called binoculars.
Oh well, sorry. Just like staring. What are you doing? 100%. I'm doing reconnaissance. Okay.
You have no idea, man. The stories.
But I do think that's a good point, because like, self-awareness is probably going to be the number one, like, I'll say virtue, but like number one benefit to people in this season that we're entering into it, because, I think that looking back on all of what 2 years has felt like, I try to not have any like regrets about the way we've done things, right? Sure. Like, just try to be like, okay, you made the best choice in front of you at the time.
That's it.
But I
might not do it again, but at that time,
right. Yeah. I'd make a different decision tomorrow, maybe. Sure. But so like, it's not about, don't look back to beat yourself up over the decisions you made. However, the one thing that I do think I would change is that the first day, first Sunday, we as a church in Waterdown decided to go online.
Sure.
I think by the time, so things were happening like Thursday, we still said we'll be online, and then Friday we still said we'd be in person. And I like stood over here in the office. I said, we're still going to be in person on Sunday. We're taking as many precautions as we can. And then like Friday hit, and we're like, well, maybe we should rethink this. And then Saturday hit, and we're like, we're pulling the plug on the service. Yeah. And so it's Saturday. So, what did I do is like, we worked, the team worked until I think it was like 3 a.m. that night, trying to get a service uploaded to YouTube. And we did. Yeah. And at the time, it was like, let's just do whatever it takes to not interrupt what feels like a significant thing. Because at the time, we're like, okay, it'll just be a couple of weeks. We'll put a few services online, and away you go. In hindsight now, I think what we lost in doing that is actually the grief of feeling like we've lost something.
Yes.
So we moved from worshiping in person to worshiping online, not seamlessly. Like, let's not kid ourselves. Like, we all had to learn so many different things.
Speak for yourself. We freaking nailed it.
Right? But like
Yeah.
it was this move that was like, okay, well, we're worshiping here, and then we're worshiping here, and I looking back on it, I wonder if it would have been healthier to say, no, we're gonna sit and grieve this as a loss,
Yeah.
and then figure out the next step, and that's what Nehemiah does. So,
Yeah.
people come to him, they're like, this is the situation in our home,
Yeah.
and the walls are destroyed, everything is burned to the ground. It's like we all got home, and it's not the way it's not what we expected,
Yeah.
and we've tried rebuilding it, and that's failed. At this point, like, it's not like they're just arrived. Like, there's been some
they've been there
work
for a
done.
while.
Like, it's and none of it's working.
Yeah.
And Nehemiah doesn't just go, okay, I've got a solution, let's go.
That's it. Well, you are talking to a master builder, so
Right.
let me get my tools and we'll slip away in the night. No,
Yeah, he sits and he grieves. Right?
Yeah.
He says, I sat down and I wept.
Yeah.
For some days I mourned and fasted. And I think that this is one thing that like our Jewish brothers and sisters do significantly better than at least like our flavor of like Christianity in
Totally.
certainly
in
like
the West.
in the West,
Especially in the West,
is like
yeah.
we struggle to mourn. And I said, like, we, like human beings, we like to pursue and prolong pleasure.
Yes.
And we like to pain, forget it.
No,
We
that's
want to
it.
avoid and hide and
Bury it down,
Yeah.
drown it, usually.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
a lot of, yeah,
Right.
no, it's true.
And so, like, I think it's probably worth saying that in your journey of self-awareness and just gauging where you are right now,
Yeah.
you also need to be okay being honest with yourself and saying, no, actually, I may need to enter into a season of grief that's been delayed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the risk in so we're talking about rebuilding. The risk in rebuilding is just to simply jump to the end of the story
Yes.
and be like, let's paint a picture of what could be, and let's all start working in that direction, and let's put energy, and let's get excited, and what did we do? We started the series by saying, and you will need to grieve.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to just double down on, because
Absolutely.
what might be the first step for you and for many of us, like I'm even feeling this in my own life, like there's probably like a delayed grief of the last 2 years that you haven't allowed yourself to feel just because you're trying to cope and survive and continue working or continue raising your kids or continue putting on so that you don't so that you don't yell at them every single day. Like you're just trying to keep one foot in front of the other, one day in front of the other. And it may require, getting honest with your emotions might lead you to some places of grief.
Yeah.
But that might be exactly what you need
Yeah.
before you take the next step after.
And you worded this really well. I don't think I used the word specifically, but you really talked about what it means to humble ourselves before God. And I think that that's a very important piece of this, is that, again, in the West, we don't like to say we're sorry. We don't like to say we made a mistake. We don't like to say, we never say we're wrong. But being humble before God, because I think some of it comes from a place of, well, if I say that, then that can affect the way people think of God, or that can make God look weak. Couple of things. How we feel doesn't affect God. It doesn't, right? Like it really doesn't. The mistakes we've made or continue to make don't change God's heart. They don't change God's witness. They don't change God's faithfulness. It's simply a reflection of where we are. And like it doesn't help us to pretend that it's not the case. It doesn't help us to pretend that and so I really appreciate what you mentioned there, that ability for us to come and say, I'm not okay. Maybe I did say some things that really hurt people early on in this. Maybe I still am, because I've dug my heels in and I won't let up. And I'm not talking to one group in particular, because the they and them statements that have filled our media the last couple of years. Because the same is true for everyone, friends. That whenever one of us has planted a foot on one side of the line, we all know when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. And when you say yes to someone, you're saying no to someone else. And so believe us, we've felt that as church leaders, as pastors. When we say yes to online, we know that that's saying no to others. And that's not just us, that's our elders and all the leaders that are a part of the decisions that are made at our two churches. Just as when we decided to go back, that was a yes to that, and a no to remaining online again. And I know that these are difficult topics for us to have. But for us, whenever we make those decisions, to ground ourselves in that attitude of humility before God that says, this is where I am, I think. Thank you for still being you, right? Like, I'd love a hand right now. Like those are again, not steps that are usually a waste of time. Like that's so very important.
Yeah. So Nehemiah prays. I do think he's honest, right? Yeah. Like if there's one word that I think that captures that, right? So, to say everybody needs to enter into a season of grieving wouldn't be honest.
Yeah.
But many people do. I would tend to guess that most people do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
something, right? Like it might not be top to bottom. Like some people's lives have been top to bottom flipped on their heads.
Yeah.
And others not so much.
Yeah. The main thing is to be honest with where you're at. And then, to live in that for a little bit.
Yeah. And
I think honesty is, to be honest with yourself maybe is like the first step. And maybe, you getting honest before God is helpful in thinking about being honest with yourself. Maybe it's not. But I do think that being honest before God is probably the step A, like 1A and 1B. Yeah. Because then it places you in that position of like whether you're mourning, whether you are confessing, acknowledging some of the ways that maybe you have lived into brokenness or, painful things over the last 2 years. And that's going to be what ultimately prepares you for the next step. So can we talk
quickly on that? Yeah. One thing quick is that I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge too, maybe not all of us have someone that we can talk to about those things, right? Like sometimes you really got to work on your wording before you bring it out to share with others, right? Yeah. Because of the sensitivity of it, right? Like if when I talk to my wife about some big things, I got to make sure that I've thought through my wording because I know that means a lot to her, right? And so, but one of the things that I cling to every single minute of every single day is that doesn't count with God. That 1A, 1B, 1B, 1A, whatever it is, remember that you don't need to have it figured out to come to God. Sometimes we have that myth, right? That like we have to have the answers, we have to have the plan, we have to be right, then I can come to God. I don't want to embarrass myself. Embarrass away. Like that's the place that God is. Because God is far more gracious and understanding than even our partners are in life, right? Like, and I think it's important that we avail ourselves of that. God can be that filter to take the rough draft, the second draft, and the sequel that doesn't even get made. God can be all of those things to then allow us to respond in a better way, in a healthier way to the people that we share life with. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful and leads us in this direction because it's probably going to be helpful for us to name some of the places where we might need to focus our energy because as we talked through in Nehemiah, and really what we are going to try to focus heavily on in this series is how we are rebuilding together, in line with the mission of God, our church in the world.
Yes.
And that's a very important season of life for us to be in together. But equally so are these areas of life where, where we might need to rebuild personally. And so Nehemiah, we see, he prepares, right? He kind of positions himself before God. He gets honest. He humbles himself. He prays. He mourns. Like he deals with his emotions.
Yeah.
And that really does enable him to receive a plan from God.
Yes.
For Nehemiah, it's specifically, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to rebuild the wall.
Yeah.
Well, like none of us are building a wall
Yet.
Um, but
Sure.
but there are specific areas. So we're going to talk more through this series, and we don't need to do that today, about as a church, how do we build a vision that's in line with the kingdom, right? So we're very hard on like inviting people to become followers of Jesus, inviting people into that dynamic relationship with a God who loves them and with a community who loves them, right? So there's just a brilliance to that I think runs through both of our communities of faith, and that we're going to lean into over the next series. But maybe we could wrap up today by just talking about some of the practical areas that people will need to rebuild personally. So because you touched on like relationships, right? You may have relationships that need mending.
Yeah.
You may have finances that need to be sorted out after the last 2 years.
Yeah.
2 years.
You might need to adjust the dash budget or the all of those sorts of things.
And one of the things that you did, I think, really well in your sermon is talk very practically about presenting these sort of things to God, and like I think it was within the context of grief and like naming it.
Yeah.
But what are some of the areas that you would name in our lives that probably need rebuilding, that might be just helpful to think about? So relationships you named, I think finances certainly.
Yeah. I think another big one is our attitude of service, because the last 2 years have been a lot about survival, but maybe even more so just about, even inadvertently, not even intentionally, the stuff that we want and the stuff that really affect us. My wife and I were talking the other day about the fact that, for the last 2 years, I think I've maybe had a half dozen meals that I haven't picked for myself. Right? Like, never in my life have I been able to say that. Right? You always you're at other people's homes and they're putting food in front of you, and then you have to decide, okay, am I going to eat this or not? But for the last 2 years, we haven't had to do that. It's been all about what I want to do and what I want to eat and what I want to watch, and right, like, and that's the way it is. And that doesn't always translate to an attitude of how can I help others? And because that's the hand-in-hand piece to our faith, is it is not just about us. It is very much about us pursuing God, and there's a response that comes from that. And so, which is neat, because I think it directly relates to the two things that you mentioned in terms of relationships and finances. That again, for the last 2 years, a lot of those have been about what strengthens us, what keeps our family strong, what's best for our kids. What colleagues am I going to lean into at work, and those that I'm not going to at all. And absolutely what we spend money on or don't. And so, but I think a lot of that is going to take some reorientation around the idea of, so how can I serve others? What will that look like for our family, for me?
Which does, bridge the two, right? Because it's not two separate, our individual personal lives and our collective corporate life as the church. Like, that's one of the things that we want to push against, is that these two things, they're not even just like overlapping entities. Like, they are one and the same.
Yep. No,
and
for sure.
And so I think that's helpful, because maybe one of the things that we need to just be conscious of repenting of is, like, when you go through traumatic experiences, when you go through moments of upheaval, it's natural and good. Like, in the way that we are created, you go, okay, how are we going to survive?
Yes.
And that does turn you inward, looking. A church that is only trying to survive is bound to die.
Yes.
Because they're only going to do the things that please the people in the church already.
Yeah.
So that's not going to work, because every single one of us is going to die.
Yeah. No,
so,
exactly.
So how, you need to turn collectively your heart toward the world and say, how are we going to choose to do the things that we may not prefer for the sake of serving our community and inviting people into that dynamic relationship with Jesus?
Yeah.
And so what you're saying, which I think is really good, is that same attitude needs to exist at every level.
Yeah.
And maybe the areas that need rebuilding are because we in our years have just turned so
Yeah.
when is a marriage or partnership, at its weakest or worst? Well, it's when you're defending against the other. Like if you're
Absolutely.
defending yourself, and if you are inward focused and looking, and
Yeah.
you get into that spiral of no and
Yes.
uh, uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Why
uh,
did you do this and why
right.
did you do that? And yeah.
That's the most unhealthy.
Yeah.
But that's also what trauma forces us to do.
Yes.
Right? It's
Yeah.
just you naturally protect. You naturally want to
Yep.
ward off. You naturally put up guard. And so, there's probably some areas where we need to relearn how to
Yes.
go, okay,
Yeah.
and God is calling me to step through that or beyond it and say,
Yeah.
how can I serve the other?
And this is the beauty, frustration, the reality of ministry is that, we walk every day on the knife's edge of balancing both of those things, of how do we have a mind that is looking towards the world and what they need and how we can serve it and how we can meet it. And how do we preserve our identity as God's people who are strong and confident in our faith and not influenced by the world in terms of how that looks, right? Like the world should absolutely influence how we serve it, right? Like it doesn't do it, like you said at the very beginning, it's a weird thing when we expect, if we're expecting people to be Christians in order to become a Christian, that's a really weird, impossible situation to be starting with.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if we're not serving out of a place of health as Christians, then it's going to very quickly become purely social justice. Yep. It's not a bad thing, but that's not our primary calling as a church. And that's that beautiful, lovely tension that they really, I think, trained us a lot for at seminary. I think is
my favorite podcast is Unseminary.
Yes.
All the things that you wish they taught you in seminary, but probably didn't. Anyways, it's a good one.
Yeah.
But so it's I think to bring it to a landing in a really practical way. We've got this story that I hope inspires us and challenges us to think about the areas that will need rebuilding.
Yeah.
And to allow us to begin to dream about that and think, okay, there's still going to be ups and downs over the next few months and see, in this season. It's not like, only good and skyward and happiness is.
Nehemiah's story doesn't just go, and then he rebuilt the wall. No.
And everybody celebrated him and he became the new king and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
No, right. Like there's opposition.
Lots.
There's internal opposition, which is often the most common and the worst, to manage and deal with. And then there's also these moments of joy and rejoicing and celebration. Yeah. At the beginning of it, maybe the most helpful thing that we can do is simply assess, take some time to pray and to write the areas that you would long for God to rebuild.
Yeah.
Right? Name some of the brokenness that you're feeling right now. Name some of the areas of your life that you would like there to be new life in, but that you're not experiencing it. So what are the relationships that you feel are broken down?
Yeah.
And then to just sit with that for a season. And I say season, but maybe a week. Come back next week.
Absolutely.
Having done that, and we're giving homework who gives a homework on a podcast? Good grief.
We
but
do. Yeah.
But just acknowledge where you're at.
Yeah.
Be honest with yourself. Be honest before God. Write some of those areas down, like a relationship or fun. Just name it. And that was the language that you used in your sermon, which was good. You've got to finally just name it and put your flag down and say, this is what's broken. Let's just acknowledge it and trust that God is going to do something here. And that's what we see, right? Nehemiah receives a plan.
And I think we do that, again, in a lot of different other places in life.
Yeah.
Because we know if you don't name it, you're not going to fix it. When your car has a rattle, if you just go through life going, rattle on, brother, it'll be okay. Eventually it's going to become a clunk, and then it's going to become a scrape, and then you're done if you've never done anything. But when you diagnose it and name it, then you can order parts, then you can tighten what needs to be tightened. And that's just a car analogy of which I know zero. But what is it in your life that you do, right? And you're out of an item for your essentials, and you're out of milk. If you just go to the store and say, I need what I need, nothing. right? Like, but if you go in and say, I need milk, then they'll point you to the milk section, right? And so for us, and sometimes in our faith, we love to keep it at that's a good thought. Anyway, kickoff, right? Like we move on so quickly. And we would love to just really encourage you as individuals and as families. This is an awesome exercise you can get into with your kids. Some of the questions that we ask on Sunday, is who do you love to have over this past Sunday? Who's someone you love to have over to your house? And a lot of our kids took it to really talk about, and adults too, who did I used to love having over? Name those things.
Yeah.
And then you can make a plan to say, you know what, we haven't legit. I've seen my grandmother 3 times in the last 2 years, physically, face to face. I want to change that.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be time wasted to name those things. Not just relationships. Maybe it is a routine that your family used to do that you haven't done in a long time. Maybe it's an activity that you had to give up because of, we were just sharing beforehand. I think it's been a number of years since I've played some sports because it hasn't been possible. Name those things. If it's something that's worth getting back, then God will bring that to mind and help you chart a way forward.
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff.
Yep. So we're praying for you. We're going to let you go because it's been about, 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes. But take some time to name your present reality, to sit with it, to grieve, share it with with someone, and do it as a family, right? Sit down. One of the best things as a parent that I have learned the hard way is that when you are sad, it's okay to be sad in front of your kids.
Sometimes we all feel sad inside. It's just, I've heard people say.
Too bad somebody wouldn't write a book on it.
I know. Google it. See what you find.
model your emotions for your kids. As they're healthy to do so, and then name what it is that you're feeling.
We would just really encourage you to take the time and space to do some of this emotional cataloging inventory as a family. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do these things side by side with our partners in life and our children. And we really think this is a fantastic starting point for you. But I guess that kind of wraps things up for today.
Yeah.
We hope you'll tune in next week when we're looking at Nehemiah 3. The rebuilding begins. Really gets practical. But be blessed, friends, and we'll see you next week.